Today we're reading the traditional Palm Sunday text from the Gospel of Luke, the 19th chapter. After he had said this, he went on ahead of them, going up to Jerusalem. And when he had come near Bethphage and Bethany at the place called the Mount of Olives, he sent, these are suburbs of Jerusalem, by the way. He sent two of the disciples, saying, "Go into the village ahead of you, and as you enter it, you will find tied there a coat that has never been ridden. Untie it and bring it here. If anyone asks you, 'Why are you untying it?' just say this, 'The Lord needs it.'" So those who were sent departed and found it as he had told them. As they were untying the coat, the owners asked them, "Why are you untying the coat?" And they said, "The Lord needs it." It's always interesting. We've read this for years. We never have had a kind of a cryptic part of the story. We've never understood exactly what this is all about. It's kind of set up ahead of time, but we don't know how or why. Then they brought it to Jesus, and after throwing their cloaks on the coat, they set Jesus on it. As he rode along, people kept spreading their cloaks on the road. As he was now approaching the path down from the Mount of Olives, the whole multitude of the disciples began to praise God joyfully with a loud voice for all the deeds of power that they had seen, saying, "Blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord, peace in heaven and glory in the highest heaven." Some of the Pharisees in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, order these disciples to stop." But he answered them, "I tell you, if these were silent, even the stones would shout out." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. In the spring of my freshman year at college at Southwestern University in Georgetown, it's a little bit later than this time of the year. It was warm. The spring rains had come. The San Gabriel River had swollen. One of those beautiful, lovely spring afternoons Alexandra knows so well as a graduate of Southwestern. Of course, your children and grandchildren will learn about it as well. Wonderful spring afternoon. Three of my fraternity brothers decided to have a great day of fun. They took tubes and they went tubing in the San Gabriel. They were all excellent swimmers, excellent athletes. It was a day that started off with such joy and excitement. But by the end of the day, one of them was dead, swallowed up by the rivers of the San Gabriel. I wonder if you've ever had that experience of starting off with something really, really exciting and joyful, and then all of a sudden it turns into utter tragedy. I suspect that most of us are here, I certainly can tell about multiple experiences of in my own high school and also my children, where a prom so full of happiness and joy and promise and celebration turns into tragedy, or a graduation party turns into tragedy because of a drunk driving accident later in the evening. I think some of my saddest moments as a pastor have been when I've had to go to the hospital for what should have been a happy and joyful event, the birth of a child, but I go to baptize a child before it goes to the funeral home. It happens to all of us, I think, this experience of looking forward to something, having such great joy, and then all of a sudden, the darkest and most tragic of moments. Well, that is precisely what happened to the disciples as they entered into Jerusalem on this particular day. The Passover feast. This was a feast time. This was something that every good Jew looked forward to. It was a time of joy, a time of celebration, a time of community, getting together with friends. It was a sacred religious celebration as well, but it was a joyful time. They were looking forward to the Passover meal, the special community engendered by such. And then all of a sudden, it goes bad. It turns dark and tragic. And what amazes me about these stories that come down through multiple gospel writers, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, is the fact that the gospel writers themselves are so utterly upfront, candid, and honest with us about the failures of the disciples during this, what was the darkest week in all of history. If you stop and read these scriptures, you'll see that amazing, and you just kind of think about it, you'll see it's amazing that they leave nothing out. Nothing out. For instance, they tell about Jesus going into the Mount of Olives to pray, and he asks his inner circle, Peter, James, and John, to go with him. And all he asked, would you guys just sit here for a few minutes? I'm going to go a few steps up there further along, and I'm going to pray. All I'm asking is that you just stay awake. And they can't do it. It happens on multiple occasions. He comes back, he finds them asleep. He says, come on, guys. All I'm asking that you do is stay awake. He knew he was on the way to the cross. All he wanted them to do was just stay awake. The lack of perseverance. The gospel writers are absolutely, totally candid about that. Later on, there is that moment in the courtyard after they've arrested Jesus, the story that we've talked about for so many years. I think it's one of the great stories in the New Testament. It teaches us so much. St. Peter out there around the campfire. And Jesus has warned him. Jesus has warned him, before the night is over, you will deny me 3 times. And he says, never, never, never. And yet over and over again, he says to a woman who threatened him not one bit, he says, I don't know the man. I do not know the man. I don't know him. And then he hears the cock crow. That moment, when Pilate stood in front of the crowds, he said, look, it's the Passover feast. I've always promised you that I would release one person to you. Who do you want, Jesus or Barabbas? And the crowd hollers, give us Barabbas. The disciples were surely there. They were silent. They were silent, and the gospel writers tell us about it. After the resurrection, the gospel writer tells us about doubting Thomas. I won't believe it. I won't believe that he's risen until I see the nail prints in his hands myself. The gospel writers, it's just one of the most extraordinary things in the world. They tell about the remarkable failures of nerve and courage and faith of the disciples. They put it right in our faces. And I commented on this past Thursday in my Thursday column. I've always wondered about that. You know, of course, that these early, they called them the apostles. We usually refer to them as the disciples, but in the early church, they were known as the apostles. The early original apostles were revered, absolutely revered, and they were powerful. Don't you know that they could have redacted that material? I mean, by that, editing it out. They could have edited those horribly embarrassing stories out of the story had they wanted to. I'm guessing the gospel writers didn't even want to put those stories in there. It could have been interpreted as being harmful to the early church. But here's what I think happened. We'll never know the truth of this, but the only way I can figure this out, because the stories are so blunt and so embarrassing, that the disciples themselves, the early apostles, said, leave them in there. We want these stories to be in there because these stories have made us more powerful. In confronting our own sins and failures, in confronting our own shortcomings, in dealing with our own humility, we have become more powerful. Because of what happened to us, the failures of that week, we know the power of God's grace in a special way. And leave them in there because we want to be an encouragement to those who will come after us. Because those who come after us will be tempted in the same way that we've been tempted. They'll be tempted to think that they can do it. They'll be tempted to think that they're righteous. They'll be tempted to think that somehow they are faultless, blameless. Leave these stories in there because they will be just as fallible as we have been. They will be just as lacking in courage as we were. Leave the stories in there as a sign that spiritual humility leads to spiritual power. Spiritual power. I wonder, have you been following this new pope? This is just the most amazing thing I've ever seen. I never thought that I would live to see something like this. You may not have seen, this is Pope Francis. This is a story about an interview that Pope Francis did when he was still Cardinal Bergoglio. He did it last year with the Catholic churches, with a Catholic newspaper of some kind. And the subject of celibacy of priests came up. And the future Pope began the conversation with a personal anecdote about his years as a seminarian. He talks about admitting being tempted by a woman as a seminarian. This is what he says. I was dazzled by a girl that I met at an uncle's wedding. I was surprised by her beauty, her intellectual brilliance, and well, I was bowled over for quite a while. I kept thinking about her. When I returned to the seminary after the wedding, I could not pray for over a week because every time I tried to do so, that girl appeared in my head. I had to rethink what I was doing. Did you hear that? The Pope admitting that he was tempted by sin. I don't know about you, but in my view, that kind of candor and humility and admission of infallibility makes this Pope the most powerful Pope I've seen in my lifetime. That's what these early apostles, St. Peter the first, were trying to get at when they left these stories in there, isn't it? They wanted us to know that we who came after them would be tempted as well. But that the grace of God is available to all as long as we own our spiritual humility. Every once in a while, somebody will say to me, Don, why don't you talk to us more about sin? And that's a pretty good question. I probably ought to, because I believe in sin. I'll just give you a code word. I tend to use the word fallibility, rather than sin. I just think it says it in a different way. You see, to me, there are two ways of thinking about sin. And probably they're both legitimate in the Christian tradition, but I believe that one is correct and the other is wrong. One way of thinking about sin is believing that we are all born depraved. That we come into this world as evil creatures, separated from God, and we're not made right until that chasm is closed. The other way of thinking about sin is that we come into the world innocent, the precious children of God, good. But that as we grow older, we make choices, we make decisions, because that was God's gift to us, right? The gift of freedom. As we grow older, we make choices which separate us from others and separate us from God. The great German theologian Paul Tillich said that sin is separation from God. As we grow older, we make choices that separate us from God, and that is sin. You see, I believe that one is accurate for two reasons. For one, that's what the Bible tells us. The Bible tells us that God created and said it was good. And we know that God doesn't create evil things. And the other reason I believe that that's the accurate understanding of sin is because it conforms with what I observe in the world. When I carry a little baby down these aisles, I know I'm carrying an innocent child of God. No doubt about it. And so this understanding, of course, we are all sinful because we make choices that separate us from others and from God. Dr. Ernest Campbell was one of the greatest preachers I've ever heard. For many years, he was the preacher at Riverside Church in New York City. And I heard him one time in Wichita Falls. He gave a lecture, and he talked about teaching a class of seminarians one time. They were talking about Paul's verse, all have sinned and fallen short of the grace of God. All have sinned and fallen short of the grace of God. He said there was a young man in the class, kind of a smart aleck, and he raised his hand. He said, Dr. Campbell, which all is that? All of us or all of them? That's the way we'd like to think of it, isn't it? All of us or all of them? That's the cardinal sin of the church, isn't it? The tendency to think that it's us versus them. Let me tell you something. When a preacher stands in front of his or her congregation, or gets in front of a news reporter, or stands in front of a television camera and says, all of them are the sinners, in my book, that's the cardinal sin. because Paul was clear about it. It's all of us. All of us have sinned and fallen short of the grace of God. And so let me give you a way to think about this Holy Week as now we get ready to march into this very solemn, dark, meaningful week. These scriptures, when you open them up, these scriptures are the gifts that come to you and me from the early apostles. They said, no. Don't take that stuff out of there. Leave it all in there. Because those who come after us will need to know that it's all of us who have sinned and fallen short of the grace of God. And hopefully they will discover in their own way that in the presence of powerful spiritual humility, all of us encounter this powerful grace of a loving God who loves us and cares for us more than we can possibly know. May that be so for you and for me in this Holy Week. Amen.